The Long Road to Women's Suffrage. As we celebrate the centennial of women's suffrage in America and the founding of the League of Women Voters, let's take a look back to gain a better understanding of why it took such a long time for women to achieve what today is considered to be a fundamental right of citizenship, the right to vote. The long struggle to achieve voting rights for women is a case study in how difficult it is to move the needle for social reform, especially when it threatens those in power. There were a host of obstacles that stood in the way, including sexism, classism, religion, politics, racism, and human nature being what it is, infighting within the movement itself. The earliest stirrings of an organized effort began during the anti-slavery movement. The World Anti-Slavery Convention met for the first time in 1840 at Exeter Hall in London, and two influential American women, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, decided to attend, even though women were not invited to participate and were forced to sit in the gallery. The two women became good friends and resolved to form a society to advocate for the rights of women. And 8 years later, they did just that. 1848 is a key year in the history of women's rights. The very first Women's Rights Convention was held at Seneca Falls, New York, organized by those same two women and billed as a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. It resulted in two documents, the Declaration of Sentiments and a list of resolutions, including one regarding a woman's right to vote. Lucretia Mott, surprisingly, was not in favor of the voting resolution, but Frederick Douglass, the convention's sole African American attendee, argued for its inclusion, and it was retained. For quite some time, women's suffrage took a back seat to the abolition of slavery movement, but there were strong links between the two groups. Quakers, like Lucretia, who belonged to William Lloyd Garrison's anti-suffrage society, were among the most vocal. She speaks her mind in this quote, "I have no idea of submitting tamely to injustice inflicted either on me or on the slave. I will oppose it with all the moral powers with which I am endowed. I am no advocate of passivity." The 1848 Seneca Falls Convention inspired a series of annual women's rights conventions, the first in 1850 in Worcester, Massachusetts. It was attended by a wide range of reform leaders, both male and female, and the topics included voting rights for women, equal wages, expanded education and career opportunities, women's property rights, marriage reform, and temperance. Here are some of the more well-known attendees: Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Lucy Stone, and Sojourner Truth. The women's suffrage movement was put on hold during the Civil War years as the nation grappled with dismantling the institution of slavery. Upon the war's end, the 13th, 14th, and 15th constitutional amendments codified citizenship and voting rights for former slaves. Unfortunately, the newly awarded voting rights applied only to black men. This infuriated many white suffragists and foreshadowed an ongoing racial divide that would splinter the movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton complained that if that word male be inserted, it will take us a century at least to get it out. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton began their decades-long partnership for women's rights in 1851. Anthony managed the business affairs while Stanton did most of the writing. They published a newspaper called The Revolution, formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, and carried their message across the U.S. and abroad. Anthony caused a stir in 1872 when she voted in Rochester, New York, in violation of state law. During the famous trial, United States versus Susan B. Anthony, She argued that the 14th Amendment overrode state law. The judge directed the jury to find her guilty and sentenced her to pay a fine of $100. When she refused to pay, he declined to jail her, so this prevented her from taking her case to the Supreme Court. In addition to the National Woman Suffrage Association, led by Anthony and Stanton, a second organization, the American Woman Suffrage Association, appeared in the post-Civil War era. Less radical than the NWSA, it was led by abolitionist Lucy Stone and had a stronger focus on racial equality as a stepping stone to equality for all. The two groups finally reconciled in 1890 to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association, abbreviated to NASA. And here's a photo taken at NASA's 37th Annual Convention at Portland's First Congregational Church in 1905. The site and date were chosen to coincide with the Lewis and Clark Exposition. Susan B. Anthony was in declining health at the time, but managed to deliver the closing benediction. She died 8 months later, at the age of 86. Given that equality for women was the goal, a shameful aspect of the movement was that the white leaders did not practice equality within their own organizations. They often acted as if the movement was an exclusive club for white, affluent members, and in their zeal to achieve suffrage, were especially reluctant to rock the boat in the Jim Crow South. That meant that black suffragists, who dedicated their lives to both racial and political equality, were often sidelined. Here are just a few of those leaders: Frances Harper, Charlotte Fortin, Charlotta Rollin, and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. Then, in the late 1800s, the path forward took a significant detour when another social reform effort became entwined with the suffrage movement and nearly derailed it. That was the temperance movement, whose followers viewed abstinence from drinking as a moral virtue. Frances Willard, founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, saw women's votes as necessary to achieving her goal of prohibition. So many suffragists were persuaded to jump on the temperance bandwagon. The states of the West were much more successful in granting women's suffrage, starting with Wyoming in 1890. The history, geography, and culture of the West gave women a higher status and a greater degree of independence. The sizable voting bloc of women in the western states would prove to be a valuable asset for the suffragists. Oregon's efforts to gain women's suffrage began in 1871, when local writer Abigail Scott Duniway joined forces with Susan B. Anthony on an extensive lecture tour and petition campaign. Between 1884 and 1910, Abigail led 5 separate attempts to pass a state constitutional amendment, all unsuccessful. Toward the end, she blamed the temperance movement's involvements, and her health began to fail. But in 1912, Dr. Esther Pohl Lovejoy of Portland founded Everybody's Equal Suffrage League and was instrumental in the amendment's passage on the 6th try in 1912, giving Oregon women the right to vote. Meanwhile, suffragists in England were electrifying the world and gaining lots of publicity for their violent protests, long prison sentences, and hunger strikes. A young American named Alice Paul was studying there at the time and found herself caught up in the movement. She was befriended by Emmeline Pankhurst and her 2 daughters, who instilled in Alice the notion that radical forms of protest were necessary to achieve the goal of suffrage. Alice would take those lessons to heart when she returned to the States. Before Alice Paul arrived on the scene, suffragist leaders were largely older, more genteel women such as Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt, who succeeded Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton as presidents of NASA. They didn't know what to make of someone like Alice Paul, who had endured 7 arrests and 3 imprisonments in England. She and her good friend Lucy Burns attracted younger, more militant followers and soon broke away from NASA to form a competing organization called the Congressional Union, which later became the National Women's Party. The rivalry between Cat and Paul was often bitter, since their approaches were vastly different. While the National Women's Party got lots of attention in the headlines, Carrie Chapman Catt used a much quieter behind-the-scenes campaign, what she called her winning strategy. Alice Paul was a genius at generating publicity, and one of her boldest strokes was organizing a giant women's suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. in March of 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson was to be inaugurated as president. This is the impressive cover of the official program. Suffrage delegates, 5,000 strong from across the nation, arrived and arranged themselves in formation along with 20 parade floats, 9 bands, and 4 mounted brigades. Quite an impressive sight, but not without controversy. Alice Paul had asked black suffragists not to participate, since she felt that their presence might detract attention from the cause of women's suffrage. But before the marchers got very far, it quickly turned into a free-for-all. Marchers were jostled, tripped, and some violently attacked, while the police on the parade route did little to stop them. Here's the scene on Pennsylvania Avenue that day. But in retrospect, the parade was a smashing success, since Alice Paul got exactly what she craved, the attention of America and of President Wilson. Of course, the increased visibility and aggressive tactics of the suffragists caused an inevitable backlash. Many anti-suffrage groups, including members of both sexes, sprang up. Josephine Dodge's National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage and Everett Wheeler's Man's Suffrage Association were 2 of the most prominent. Not all women were anxious to be associated with the increasingly militant suffragists, and men had very little incentive to change the status quo. Much of the resistance to women's rights was a value system that was prevalent among the middle and upper classes in England and the U.S. during the 19th century, and remained exceedingly difficult to dislodge. It had religious underpinnings and was sometimes called the cult of true womanhood. A woman's sphere was the home, and true women were supposed to possess the 4 cardinal virtues of piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness. Voting was part of the ugly business of politics and quite beyond a woman's sphere. Those who felt threatened by the demand for women's rights fought back by demeaning and demonizing the suffragists. For example, the term suffragette was a derogatory term that was meant to downplay their significance. Here's a sampling of some of the postcards and posters that portrayed suffragists in a very unflattering light. These 2 suggest that suffragists deserve severe punishment. Suffragists are anti-family. Which do you prefer for woman, home or the street corner? No true woman would want to be a suffragist since they are unattractive man-haters. And no man would want to marry a suffragist, so she will inevitably end up as a spinster. The U.S. entry into World War I was the catalyst that forced change upon the nation. It made people realize that with men going off to war, women had to pitch in and do much more than tend the home. Who shares the cost of war? This poster perfectly expresses the new reality. Here's an excerpt. Who plant fields and harvest crops when all the able-bodied men are called to war? Who keep shops and schools and work in factories while men are in the trenches? Who nurse the wounded, feed the sick, support the helpless, and brave all danger? The answer is clearly women. The other major event that had a big impact on the women's suffrage movement turned out to be the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. With 50 million deaths worldwide and men dying at a much higher rate than women, there was much more need for women to step into jobs outside the home. Alice Paul had decided early on that President Wilson was her main obstacle, and she made it her mission to put pressure on him using any means necessary. He refused to support a federal amendment, preferring the safer political ground of leaving it up to individual states. Starting in January of 1917, Alice directed her followers to hold signs and stand in shifts day and night in front of the White House. They were given the name the Silent Sentinels for their strategy of using silence as a form of protest. They were initially tolerated, and the president would tip his hat to them as he passed by. But he soon grew tired of the constant pressure, and by November, 218 suffragists had been arrested for, quote, obstructing sidewalk traffic, and many were hauled to the local jail or the nearby Occoquan workhouse, where the conditions were atrocious. When Alice Paul was imprisoned in October of that year and placed for 2 weeks in solitary confinement, she decided to use the tactic she had learned in England, a hunger strike. Others joined her. Prison authorities proceeded to force-feed the women with raw eggs through feeding tubes. Prison sentences grew longer. But it was on the night of November 14, 1917, that the treatment of the suffragists inside the Occoquan workhouse got so bad that it is now referred to as the Night of Terror. 40 guards were ordered to brutalize the women. According to accounts of that night, they beat Lucy Burns, chained her hands to the cell bars above her head, then left her there for the night. They threw Dora Lewis into a dark cell and smashed her head against an iron bed, knocking her out. Alice Cosu, concerned deeply about Dora's condition, suffered a heart attack. Dorothy Day was slammed repeatedly over the back of an iron bench. Guards grabbed, dragged, beat, choked, pinched, and kicked other women. But there was one silver lining that came out of all of this. When word of the torture got out, it caused a turning point in public opinion. 1918 was a pivotal year. In January of 1918, President Wilson caved to the pressure, announced his support for the women's suffrage amendment, and the House of Representatives narrowly passed it. However, the Senate wouldn't budge, and arrests of protesters continued throughout the summer. When the Senate vote finally happened in October, it failed by 2 votes. But the November election was coming up, so the suffragists turned their energy toward electing more pro-suffrage members of Congress. On December 19th, desperate to keep up the pressure, protesters outside the White House burned Wilson's words in watchfires, and 2 months later, burned his image in effigy. When Congress convened in the spring of 1919, the stage was finally set for the historic vote on the amendment, which was dubbed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. On May 21st, it passed the U.S. House, and on June 4th, suffragists thronged the Senate galleries in anticipation of the final vote in the Senate. When the outcome was announced, 56 to 25, they broke into deafening applause that lasted for 2 full minutes. But they knew their work wouldn't be complete until it was ratified by at least 36 states, which is the 3/4 needed to ratify a constitutional amendment. So the race was on, and the office of the National Women's Party in D.C. was alive with activity. Alice Paul made a show of sewing a star on the suffrage victory banner when each new state legislature ratified the amendment. On June 10th, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin had the honor of being the first. By early January of 1920, the number of states was at 24, and Oregon was in the queue to be number 25. A special session of the Oregon legislature was convened on January 12th. A bit of confusion occurred when Representative Sylvia Thompson, the only woman serving in the legislature at that time, and Senator Robert Farrell Sr. each introduced the measure in their respective chamber. The procedural glitch was resolved the next day when Senator Farrell dropped his measure and allowed Representative Thompson's to go forward. Governor Ben Alcott's signature made it official. That same month, another important event took place. In Chicago, Illinois, at the annual convention of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Association President Carrie Chapman Catt declared the formation of the League of Women Voters as a mighty political experiment to help 20 million women carry out their new responsibilities as voters. Maud Wood Parker was elected the first president of the League, but Carrie Chapman Catt served as the organization's honorary president until her death in 1947. She would be proud to know that the League remains a vibrant organization with 50 state leagues and over 1,000 local leagues. Alice Paul continued to sew new stars on the banner, although 5 southern states, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, rejected it in fairly short order. On March 22nd, Washington state became number 35, and just one more state was needed. But when 4 months went by and both Mississippi and Delaware rejected it, tension was running high. By August, it looked like Tennessee might be their last hope, but it too was a southern state and likely to follow the lead of the others. Their hopes rose when the Tennessee State Senate voted to ratify, but then were dashed when the vote in the House ended in a tie. That's when a 23-year-old legislator named Henry Burns read the note that his mother had sent him, followed her advice, and broke the tie to ratify the amendment, thereby giving all American women the right to vote. The date was August 18th, 1920. And Alice Paul was able to proudly unfurl the banner with all 36 stars from the suffrage headquarters window in D.C. Her years of sacrifice and single-mindedness had finally paid off. The 19th Amendment was formally adopted into the U.S. Constitution by proclamation of Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby on August 26, 1920. These 24 simple words were the culmination of over 70 years of struggle. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States on account of sex. But the amendment was certainly not the end of the struggle for equal rights, especially for African Americans and disenfranchised minorities throughout the country. As we well know, the struggle to ensure the rights guaranteed by the 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments was reignited during the Civil Rights era and continues to this day.